Hello and welcome to the latest in a series of classics and ancient history podcasts from Blackwell Online. My name is George Miller, and my guest in the second part of a two-part podcast is Alastair Blanshard, who teaches classics at the University of Sydney. We met up recently at the Blackwell's offices in Oxford to talk about his new book, Sex, Vice and Love from Antiquity to Modernity. In part one, following the structure of his book, we talked about how our views of ancient sexuality are shaped in particular by our view of Rome, and such phenomena as the Roman orgy. In part two, we turned to Greece and Greek love. I began this part of the interview by quoting something Alastair writes in the introduction to the second half of his book. Democracy would have come into being without Athens. Philosophy would have continued without Socrates. The laws of physics have no real need of Archimedes. But modern Western homosexuality without the Greeks is impossible. I asked him to defend that provocative statement.
Well, I should say that that statement was being deliberately provocative, but it's a statement that I think, has some legs. And I think, I wanted to make it because I think if you do find it provocative, first of all, it's worthwhile remembering that you're probably the first generation that's ever found that provocative. That is, that, up until the late 20th century, any discussion of homosexuality had to involve the Greeks in some form. They were considered absolutely crucial for any understanding or conception of homosexuality. So the fact that we think we can forget the Greeks is only a remarkably, modern turn. But I think the other thing that I wanted to say in making that statement is that I wanted to again push the line that, as in so much in regards to sexuality, it's not like it's a blank slate. That, I make the point that, coming out of the closet is not, as it were, coming out into a vacuum. That instead you come out into a world in which there is all sorts of pre-packaged ideas or conceptions, and those conceptions often have their roots in the world of ancient Greece. And there's a long history, and I think that that's something we really need to kind of take into account.
Now, in the second part of the book, you adopt a more chronological approach. The first part looks at Rome and is more thematic or generic, looking at different ways in which sexuality has been appropriated. But in the second part, when you're looking at homosexuality and Greece, you have this chronological approach. Tell me what you were attempting to do there.
Well, I wanted to try and capture in this book the different ways in which we relate to the ancient world. There are moments when, as it were, we in the ancient world just seem to be in dialogue. That is, that the moments where suddenly it's, you see something in Pompeii, or you hear a production of a Greek tragedy and it speaks to your condition, and that immediacy in that moment is what's crucial. But there are also moments, and this is what I decided to explore in the discussion of Greek love, where in fact that relationship with antiquity is part of a tradition. That is, that it's not just that you're speaking or hearing from something from the ancient world, but rather you're hearing something from the ancient world that has been gone through Renaissance imaginings, has been discussed by the Enlightenment, that has been part of a 19th century political project, and has come to you in the 20th century through all these stages. And so it was both this way of the immediacy, which I wanted to look in the first part of the book, and this notion of tradition in the second part, because these are both important modes, I think, for understanding our relationship with the ancient world. And so I wanted to try and capture or give an example of how each of these modes might work.
And this refraction of Greek love in Western culture begins with Rome, doesn't it? You describe Greek love very nicely as a stowaway coming from Greece to Rome. So to say why you describe it in that way.
Well, I think what I wanted to stress is that, partly I wanted to just talk about Greek love in terms of a context of inheritance. This, when we talk about the things that Rome adopted or learnt from Greece, we kind of focus on philosophy, and we talk about mathematics, and we talk about architecture and artistic styles and so forth, but we don't talk about homosexuality. So I wanted to kind of put homosexuality alongside those things that Rome received from Greece. And the other thing I wanted to do was talk about how that it's Rome's understanding of what constitutes Greek homosexual practice, which stylizes and almost kind of refracts and concretizes what is a pretty amorphous picture. So that if you look at Greek love as practiced in Greece, there are very different kind of models, there are very different kinds of practices. There's no really one dominant story. what we start to see with Rome is the beginning of, as it were, one very distinct vision of homosexual practice. And that's what I wanted to do, is talk about the way in which Rome is really crucial in that story, because it's that first moment when we start to see the story being put together.
So how do Roman structures and Roman power relationships cope with homosexuality?
Rome has its own indigenous homosexual tradition, and we can see that, for example, in plays like Plautus, for example, where we see references to homosexuality and homosexual acts occurring. But I think what we see with the adoption of Greek homosexual practices is a way in which elements like, for example, status difference between lovers, about the way in which sexual practice could be a marker of identity and of about learning, all these things start to enter into the mix. So if you're a Roman and want to indicate, for example, that you are a lover of Greece, that you're sophisticated cosmopolitan, well, there are a number of ways you can do it. You can, for example, put on Greek games. You can write, philosophical texts in Greek. You can also take a male lover. And I think that those are, we need to sort of see it as part of that kind of process.